Welcome everybody to today's discussion on the decolonization of knowledge. This is session number 15 of our decolonial reading group. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that even though we are meeting in a digital space, we are doing it in the name of Columbia University, which was built on Lenape land in Manhattan. And some of us are also physically in these territories. I wish this was more than a symbolical acknowledgement, but in any case, I'm deeply grateful that we can meet in the space and take the time to decolonize our minds. After a very refreshing session with Eleni Sontim Zelike 2 weeks ago, today we will again be talking about musicality and the significance of listening for the decolonial context. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome and introduce Professor Ana Ochoa to you. Ana Maria Ochoa Gautier is professor and chair of the Department of Music and faculty member at the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University. Her book, Orality, Listening, and Knowledge in 19th Century Columbia, published at Duke University Press in 2014, which we have been reading in preparation for this session, was awarded the Alan Merriam Prize by the Society for Ethnomusicology. She's also the author of Músicas Locales en Tiempos de Globalización, publicado en Buenos Aires, en Norma, en 2003, and Entre los Deseos y los Derechos, un ensayo crítico sobre políticas culturales, published in Bogotá en el Ministerio de Cultura, also in 2003. She writes on music and cultural policy, forced silence and armed conflict, and genealogies of listening and sound in Latin America and the Caribbean. Her current projects explore the bioacoustics of life and death in colonial histories of the Americas. She has been a distinguished Greenleaf Scholar in residence at Tulane University in 2016 and a Guggenheim Fellow in 2007 and 2008. She has served on the advisory boards of the Society for Cultural Anthropology, the Demos Project at the Cité de la Musique Philharmonie de Paris, and the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. Querida Ana, it is a very big pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much for taking the time, despite all your obligations, and we are very honored to have you and very much looking forward to your presentation and the discussion with you. Thank you so much.
So thank you, gracias, for being here today. I will have a little bit of a background to the book presentation before maybe engaging with the material itself, and hoping to maybe open further the discussion with questions or comments that you might have. So to begin with, the book was published in 2014, which with Duke University Press in the United States publishing Rhythms means it was finished in 2012 and already impressed by 2013. I say this because I think it's important to frame the decolonial discussion of the book as an intervention in that time, not in everything that has happened afterwards. So that's partially what the book was framed about. Second, if you notice, I don't use the word decolonial too much. I did that purposefully, partially because I wanted to have the material itself, the archival material itself, and the research into that archival material itself carry the problem of the colonial and what the approach to decolonizing involved. So each chapter addresses a different dimension. And even within chapters, there's different possibilities, okay? So I want to frame it that way because the word is not going to be a highly prioritized word in the book, but it is a book centrally involved with that. And I can talk about why later on for now. So I just want to bring that forth. When I was writing the book, I think for me, the most, at that moment, first of all, I believe there are many decolonials, not just one. And I imagine throughout these 15 sessions, which I have unfortunately not been able to join because I'm chair for 5 more weeks and have been extremely busy. But so there's not just one framework. And so, but within, at that particular moment, there was one prevailing framework, which was the Decolonial Studies Group, coordinated by Mignolo and Arturo Escobar and Santiago Castro Gomez, and the group that initially produced those very key foundational readers for Latin American, let's say, decolonial approaches. And that was what then was called the decolonial. So my first approach is to say that even then, when I was writing the book, I saw a history of archival materials that questioned the idea that there was one decolonial. Not only archival materials, but even framings that are complicated. But, you know, what do we do with glissant, or what would we do with even somebody as complex as Fernando Ortiz, or et cetera, within these framings? Or in my book, Candelario Beso, right? Or, you know, other types of characters, which are complex characters that belong, as we do, in very, you know, fundamental ways to positionings of themselves as simultaneously, let's say, decolonial, but within the power structures of the time, of the 19th century. So that's one form of framing it. And for me, in that sense, I did not want to write this book as a reply to the decolonial studies as it was framed then. I just did not want to do that, because I thought the material itself would lose. The archival material is so incredibly rich that if I would frame it as a reply to a particular mode of understanding the decolonial, then the way the archive speaks would be sort of framed in order to reply to that. So I just let it flourish and have the process, let's say, emerge differently in each chapter. So that's one element of framing. The second is that when you work with listening and the history of folklore itself, let me separate those two. So on the one hand, the formation of folkloristics and ethnomusicology as disciplines. This book emerged out of a classic in the 1990s when I was thinking about it, in early 2000s. I was thinking about a classic, what was called then, problematically, a post-colonial question, which was then moved to a decolonial, or how the word anti-colonial works with that today. Of course, it's a big question. But I was teaching between South America and the United States. I was moving back and forth, and there's no way that the ethnomusicological framework with which I taught in the US could be used in Latin America and vice versa. When I began exploring this book was not going to be about the 19th century. It was going to be about how to think a series of epistemological formations in thought from Latin America. So there's a small article that I wrote. My initial thought was that if you see people like Fernando Ortiz, Arguedas, Mario de Andrade, Manuel Zapata Olivella in Colombia, and several others that write, in the early 20th century up to the 1970s, let's say, more or less, they're all writing about music. They're all writing, they're either composers or novelists, most of them. Alejo Carpentier is another figure, Lidia Cabrera, and complex figures within. They're all writing about music. They're all trying to come out with how does local sounds fit within a national policy? Let's say this is the era of nationalism. They're all enacting questions about cultural policy. They're all working what Escobar and Restrepo at one point called informal forms of knowledges, or undisciplined knowledges, because they don't have university posts, most of them. So Mario de Andrade teaches by teaching piano lessons. Carpentier, did radio programs for a long time, etc. They're all using the vanguard technology of the time, which is radio, to divulge and disseminate ideas about radio programs. They're all touring musicians, helping musicians tour. Manuel Zapata Olivella from the Caribbean into Bogota and to Europe. Carpentier as well, the sonistas cubanos, etc. So I said, this is not at that time, the person that had mostly written about this is Elizabeth Travassos and others, but Right now, there's a series of publications about that, but it's like, okay, this is not just an accident that they're all doing this in such a similar way. This is a formation in the Foucauldian sense. So I said, so I want to study this. And that was what my Guggenheim proposal was. So when I went to the radio archives, I listened to Manuel Zapata Olivella's programs in the radio. I listened to Manuel Abadia Morales, another folklorist from Colombia. And also the fact that in Latin America, the notion of ethnomusicology only worked very minimally for some of these. In Argentina, maybe, there was a big ethnomusicological school with Carlos Vega, stuff like that. But even then, it doesn't match completely. So I began thinking, okay, what is this formation? I'm going to limit myself to Colombia. Went to the radio archives and found a lot of citations of the same 19th century figures. So I said, I have to go to the archive of the 19th century and begin to look at them. And on the one hand, there was Candelario Beso's material, which was then coming up. Now there's a lot of publications, or more publications about him. I'm not sure there's a lot, but he became a known figure within this Afro-descendant, which was pretty semi-unknown, except for African-American, Afro-Colombian scholars or African-American scholars who had worked on his materials. And somebody in Pittsburgh, I forget his name right now, which wrote the major book about him, let's say in English. But in Spanish also, they were beginning to work on him as it was beginning to work on him too. So there was that person. And then there was the sound of the bogas as well. So I went to look for these materials because Candelario Beso worked as a boga. I looked for these materials of the Magdalena River, and in the compilation of materials, I found also these descriptions by Humboldt of the sounds of the bogas. Okay, and that stopped the book. That stopped the 20th century book, which is yet a book I have to do. I have this full file cabinet with Manuel Zapata Olivella materials, and I said, I don't know what to do with this. I apologize for the noise out here. There's New York University construction, New York City construction. So I said, I don't know what to do with this material, but I cannot discard it. This material is very interesting because it's not described as song. It's not described as speech. It's described as howlings. And the archive, the colonial archive, is full of people described as howling. Okay, this had already been noticed by Gary Tomlinson when he wrote his book on, singing in the New World. I was wondering always whether it was singing, actually. Did they call it singing? Is there a word for song? Is there a division between song and speech as we know it? That was a question I had. And so that material, what I said, I said, okay, I have to stop this book of the early 20th century. I need to understand this time to be able to understand how folkloristics was formed in the early 20th century in Colombia as a formation, as this general Latin American formation, this fuzzy boundary line between the literary and the sonorous, between material culture, let's say, sonorous. I also did a PhD in folklore and ethnomusicology, was very much trained in performance theory and folkloristics and ethnopoetics. So that was also part of my interest. I've always had a double love for the literary and the sonorous and the musical. So that switched the book, turned it around, and I kept finding more 19th century materials and then ended up being structured this way. And I have yet to do, and I don't know whether I will do it or not, ever, the early 20th century book, to put it that way. So that's a framing, an initial framing. And then a second element, so I could, and that's how the book was anyway organized around these people that, and then listening and sound studies was coalescing as we know it today, let's say, as I was writing. Jonathan Stern's book, The Audible Past, came out. There were a couple of other books, notably Village Bells, and others that were there, that were books about history, that of listening, that changed the way history was interpreted in the way, or understood, not only with relation to technology and media, but with relation to other historical materials as well. So that was a big key for me. Also, so this book then, when it's published, appears as an intervention in sound studies and in listening studies, precisely because of that. And at the moment it was published, very few people had written about the colonial and sound studies. And so it was an intervention in that area as well. So a lot has changed since the book was published. There's much more interventions in listening and sound in the colonial. I think the decolonial has opened up to be thought from very different ways. I still think there's, for me, a very interesting dialogue to be had between, for example, indigenous decolonial authors in North America and other authors from Latin America, as well as indigenous authors or movements or social movements or whatever as well, etc. I could add a couple more things. I don't know if you want, I don't know how long these presentations are. Okay, so for me, the book has, so this entry point in that every theory about the voice or about music has an explicit or a tacit listener attached to it. There's a supposition when I say music is this, that people hear in a certain way. Sometimes that is explicitly stated, sometimes that is not stated. So the book, begins with that idea that I take from several authors who actually have developed music theories about the place of the listener and the construction of knowledge about music. And I cite them at the introduction. So that's a major element that the book has. And each chapter approaches different dimensions of listening. Okay. The book also functions, let's say, as an archaeology of the notion of orality, O-R-A-L-I-T-Y. And the reason was because in Latin America, that there's a difference between this book and, let's say, Jonathan Stern's Audible Past book. In the Audible Past, it is stated that in the English language, in the introduction, the word aurality, A-U-R-A-L-I-T-Y, began to emerge in the 19th century and appear in written texts in the 19th century. But in the case of, let me just decline a call here. In the case of Latin American, what this book shows is that in the case of Latin America, the practice of listening does not replace the word orality. Orality will continue to be a problematic up to the present. Okay, so this idea that somehow there is a turn to how we listen, of course, has changed historically. That's true. But the idea that in 19th century, there's a turn to the inner ear because of the technology being generated doesn't work for Latin America, not because of technological backwardness. That's not the reason, because there's a lot of contribution of technology in music in Latin American sound studies, which has yet to be acknowledged. But because the voice never ceases to be a central problematic, because the idea of the popular and of popular cultures, lo popular, is going to presuppose a notion of the voice very central, several notions of the voice very centrally. So in Latin America, there is no replacement. That's part of the conclusion of orality for aurality. It doesn't happen, okay? Or at least it doesn't happen. Maybe it's happening today because of digital cultures, but even then, I would question that. It's something we would have to explore further. And then because of the multiplication of sound studies in Latin America right now. The other issue that I wanted to bring up is that perhaps the most important concept of the book. So that's why, let me finish. The title Aurality is not one I chose. The title was Excripted Sounds, but Duke University Press chose this title Aurality, but one of the reasons was precisely because of this, okay? The second is that perhaps the most important concept in the whole book is the idea of acoustic assemblages, because that's how the book proceeds. That's presented in the introduction, and the notion that there's a transformation between hearing, creating some sort of a sound emerging, that being received by another listener, and that listener inscribing that hearing onto a particular object, whether that be the skin, a waterfall, a book, And at that moment, I didn't work with a period of technological recording, of other types of recording. The technology was writing. So it's this motion that generates a mobile thing that is mediated a lot by the idea of equivocation. You know, how we hear in these intercultural relations is fraught and difficult. And so I wanted to document these movements of listening in intercultural situations. And then almost every single case documents different forms of them in the book. From the classic, let's say, epistemic dominance to more complex essays of how different peoples would intervene here. There is, of course, the problem of the archive and how to listen to people who are underwritten in the archive or written out of the archive. And that's present throughout the book. I think I'll leave it there and see if people have questions or comments, and I'll be glad to then respond or, you know, participate in whatever way I can.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating, and I really enjoyed how you described the process, but also the way you go into the archives. There's so many things you've already like touched upon that I can already ask at least 4 questions. But maybe I'll just ask one to like get the discussion going. And I know that some of the participants will definitely also have questions. So yeah, this is great. The first question I came up with while reading your book was actually something that you've also already mentioned now, which is this whole distinction, colonial distinction between nature and culture, and the human and the non-human, and body, mind, elite, subaltern, etc., etc., and how you by describing this process of listening, producing a sound that has to be heard in order to exist in this to exist, I guess, and then that sound being transcribed, and then that transcription being turned into written law, which again has a very big impact on who is included in the law, who's excluded, etc. This I thought was actually questioning very much the binarities of colonialist strategies. And I wanted to ask you if how else you would do this, or if this was part of your own decolonial practice that you don't mention explicitly, but that I did somehow see in this process.
Let me just, so one of the things that happened when I was writing was that, you know, each chapter really has a very different bibliography. Let me just close the door.
It's so nice to see everyone, by the way.
So, hi, everybody. Hola. So basically what happened was this. First of all, during the colonial period, you have this juridical problem, which is, of course, how to classify Afro-descendants, women, indigenous peoples within the colonial landscape of who has juridical rights, and were there the eternal question from day one, are these people human or not? Okay, so when you start listening to the voices, listening to a voice has that as a central problematic during this era of the 19th century, when we're redefining that problem. They're going to recast it not only as a problem of the, let's say, Spanish Empire. Now they're going to reframe it as a problem of the nation, because it's the 19th century and they've become independent and they are in the post-national period, and they have to redefine themselves as autonomous nations, quote unquote, whatever that is in the 19th century, but also reframing these within a certain framework. So what's going to happen is that they're also going to define, according to the philological work that was circulating then, what counts as, the word was oral poetry. The word in the archive I explored, the word folklore had not yet appeared. It's an invention in English in the 1880s. It's going to be used later in the 20th century. But even then, the word oral poetry, song, is going to be framed much more in this period. And so they're also trying to see what is the representative sound or in the dimensions of the nation, right? And so those two things are going to overlap in a way. And so one of the things is they're going to listen to some voices that are not going to make it into the description of proper oral poetry or proper song for the nation. And those people that are not going to make it are either for one of two reasons. One, they sound too close to animals, which is the chapter on the bogas, right? So this is a classic, you compare them to animals, therefore they cannot have, a right to a proper voice, which the citizen has to have to be able to participate in the formation of the people. Okay, and this is an acoustic voice. I'm not just talking about a metaphorical voice of the people. I'm talking about listening to them and hearing them and saying, these people are howling. What is this thing? So, for example, for the bogas, I sat and read about 22 travelogues. There was only one little paragraph or two about them, and then I selected 8 for the book. But it was a constant. Okay. The second is in the chapter where, the ethnographic ear, when Jorge Sachs goes and listens to the indigenous peoples, it's not aesthetically viable. These are not mature languages. These are languages that are only used for conversion. That's the only use they have. They cannot be used to, let's say, either be aesthetically pleasing, which was the claim of Jorge Sachs. These are aesthetically pleasing languages, nor much less to become the language of citizenship. Right. So I'm sure that debate, which happened right before the writing of the 1886 Constitution, played a role in generating, these are children, they need to change languages, and while they're children, they're going to be juridically under the role of the church. So this diminishment, and these are theories that understand children and animals as lesser beings to begin with. So there's two things inscribed here. It's not only an epistemic issue of who wins, but it's also a notion of what an animal is and what a child is, not to mention the rest. Okay, so so in the colonial period, the human then is going to be at the intersection of the question of the animal and the human because of the slave trade, because of colonialism, etc. So what I tried to do in the chapter of the bogas is do the first part saying, okay, if the Westerners say they sound like animals, this is what happened with that result. And this is the way it was framed. Okay. And then the second half, I say, okay, let's give it a try speculatively based on the material I have and try to think how the bogas, let's say, would have sounded to themselves. What if it's not a problem to sound like an animal? Because for many Northern South American indigenous peoples, including the people that live in La Sierra, right, where they, in the Northern Caribbean, imitating the sounds of animals and sounding like an animal is not something, it's not to be a lesser being, right? So it has a completely different acoustics because it's something desired to imitate. This happens in many rainforest cultures, we know ethnographically. Right. So in that case, the status of the animal and the person is completely different. And then we have a very different type of acoustomology, of epistemics of music and sound, because you learn your songs from the spirits, from the bees, from the birds, they transmit messages that are crucial to live life. You can imitate or not. Some groups do imitate them, others don't, in the sounds you produced. So I try to find an equilibrium between those 2 points of view. You can only do it speculatively. I had, and also by using all the bibliography at hand. I literally read and read again the transformations that happened between the 16th and 19th century in Colombia and Caribbean Colombia, and tried to frame them within and within contemporary ethnography of the era of the area. So I tried to frame it with those elements, and that's my methodology. But of course, there's speculation as well, like in every historical endeavor. But then the question of nature and culture will come up in every single chapter in a different way. So, but that's the most conspicuous. I don't know if other people have problems. Also because in this moment, they were, quote, organizing nature and also organizing culture. They're organizing what's the song for the nation. And these, and also they were organizing what's the proper way to document it, what's the proper way to capture it, and at the same time, they're organizing, how do we organize nature? Mauricio Nieto's books, all those other books of which there are a lot by Colombian historians. So does that help answer the question? I don't know if other people have also interventions or questions.
Please go ahead, everyone. And also, I would like to encourage you to turn on your cameras so we have a little more the feeling of being in a seminar or in a reading group in the same room. But yeah, go ahead. You also can ask questions if you don't want to turn on your camera, whatever you like. Welcome, everyone. So happy to see everyone. Who would like to ask something?
Alfonso?
Are you able to listen to me, or?
Sí.
Well, first of all, I'm in ecstasies because of you having brought a name, that of Candelario Obeso, back from centuries ago, literally. I just, well, you have already caught that I am Colombian with an O. I want to ask you, what do you, I hope it's not off the mark, my question. What do you make of cumbia? How it evolved from being, I'm going to be honest, I did my quick Wikipedia, and it didn't come out in the mid 20th century or even earlier with Lucho Bermudez, but Lucho Bermudez was the result of a long evolution. Would you say that time when cumbia was out there but not commercially successful is a typical example of coloniality or colonialism? Is how do you keep something down until I regard him as a genius anyway, if only because I'm a bad dancer. But both him and Jose Barros and others, but particularly those two. But before the emergence, there was something that was submerged, and I guess there were no books about cumbia. No. I mean, it was not regarded as a mankind type of music, but either children or your thoughts, please, Ana Maria.
Yes, I'm going to be very brief because I don't study cumbia. So it's not part of my work, but there are several people that do. So on the one hand, there is an edited volume by Mauricio Pardo You can find it online, in which there are a couple of entries about the historical archive regarding cumbia and cumbiamba and other types of feasts in the Caribbean. The second, so you can just find that. It's an edited volume, I forget the name, by Mauricio Pardo. The second is another person that works on cumbia a lot, is Juan Sebastián Ochoa in Colombia. Those are the two I can remember, but just a search for that will give, you know, many other results. I do not work on that material. It's a huge topic in Colombia, but it has been addressed as a colonial, an issue of, you know, colonial imposition, also the struggle between how to define the nation later on between Andean notions of music and Caribbean notions of music. But so that's a brief answer. But I don't work on that material. So I don't, it's a complex material. It has been worked on by people that are specialists on the topic. So I'm not a specialist on the topic. Yeah.
Thank you.
Who else has a question? I'm actually fascinated by how you bring together the different disciplines, which is something that I feel like explicitly or implicitly decolonial scholars do a little more often than others, or at least in Europe, having been raised in the universities there, I've been very, you know, I've been trained very harshly to not bring different disciplines together. And once, for example, I taught the seminar on intonations of poetry in songs, and that was already like almost too much. So the way you do it is amazing. And I think that was also, yeah, where my question is going, because all of a sudden we do have in creative moments, this is why I think the question about dance makes sense. We do have different disciplines that come together, and then we have to deal with them somehow. Or even in like a rhetorical figure, like it's synesthesia, we have everything at once. We like think orality and vision together, or like sound and vision together all of a sudden. And yeah, this is fascinating. But like this is just me trying to not ask another question and to let everybody else.
I also welcome people to ask questions in Spanish, and I can just translate them back or whatever. So basically, ethnomusicology is by default a very interdisciplinary field. But also what happened with this book took a long time, both because I was working on other materials at the same time and, you know, teaching and all that stuff. It took about 14 years or 12 years to do, but also because I spent a long time learning. I was not a historian. I had never published as a historian. I felt terrified of getting into this archive. I knew I couldn't leave the materials. The materials just fascinated me. And so I spent more or less about 2 years with the bibliography of each chapter. That meant a learning curve. The book taught me a lot that I still have to unravel and use, but I learned a lot writing this book. Materials that didn't make it there or made it in reference, but I'm still using and continuing to use without such being strictly attached to the archive, to the 19th century Colombian archive, because some of these questions are valid beyond Colombia itself. So I think part of the interdisciplinarity is born out of necessity. I had to go and read, you know, this, when you're doing research with the archive, one of the interesting things is you go back and forth between what you find and then how you look for your reference bibliographic materials, and then you go back to the archive, and then it opens up a world. And since it opens up a world, you have to sort of be open to, okay, where is this going to take me? So I had the luxury of this is, you know, I'm older. I could take a longer time with the book. And that's what I did. I took a longer time with the book. And so I learned a lot of material that I would otherwise had not read. I also came from a very strong cultural studies background. If you read my earlier books, in a way, the social phenomenon is at the center. And this book really marks a turning point for me, because there's something for me that was missing about the musical phenomenon itself. However, something like a howling could not be inscribed through musical parameters themselves. They did not work, right? And so it was not only addressing the music disciplines, which I did a lot of reading about music disciplines I hadn't done before, particularly music theory or philosophy of music theory. Not that the musicologists have begun to work more historically, but they don't. There's a branch of music theory, of what in the United States is called music theory, which is dealing with the philosophy of music theory. How do philosophically account for stylistic parameters? You know, what is rhythm, what is sound, what is resonance, what is music, etc. And that's the branch that helped me. And so I had to have access to this material to ask this very sound question. Sound comes in not to do away with music or language as sonic elements, but because what I was hearing was both regarding an intermediate site of the voice. It can be language, it can be music, it can be something else. So also in Latin American cultures, the boundary line between language and music is not strict. That's why folkloristics was much stronger than ethnomusicology in Latin America, because people would go out and collect short stories and folklore and myth and proverbs and songs, and they were all part of the same packet. Moreover, in indigenous cultures, the division between music and language as strictly aesthetically, or Afro-descendant cultures as strictly differentiated, does not make sense. So there were many reasons to ask this question, and that led me to a lot of readings. So I think it's a type of interdisciplinarity that was new for me. Not that it was new, but that it was a type of interdisciplinarity that was new for me. And I learned a lot. And I think when you bring in the question of music or the sonorous into play, the unfolding of that into multiple disciplines is almost inevitable. But it's not only social sciences. Something about the acoustic world itself has to come into play. Okay, it's so how do you do readings in how people deal with a musical phenomenon, a sonorous phenomenon itself, and how does fields like music theory come in there to help us understand philosophies of music? Even if they have been framed from the West, I think there's a lot of materials that has not been framed from the West, or that are critical of that framing, especially right now. There's a big critique, a push of a critique because of, let's say, racism implicit in the fields. So that's coming forth more and more. So that's the reason I had to look for these materials. I also realized the book is it's going to come out in Spanish, by the way, within the next year. So it's going to be available hopefully soon, in about 6 months. So it's almost done. And I think it reads better in Spanish than in English. This was a very difficult book for me to write. And as I read the translation, it reads much more fluidly. So the translation and some rewriting, rewriting so that it makes sense. I'm not changing the argument at all.
I thought it was great to read.
Okay.
Who else wants to share their impressions of their readings? I know some of the people here in the group have worked on 19th century Colombian writers as well. Might know the novel Maria.
¿Podría preguntar en español?
Claro, yes.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la presentación. He seguido tu trabajo desde que estuviste en el Congreso sobre el costumbrismo en el siglo XIX en la Universidad de los Andes, en el que diste la conferencia de cierre, donde hablaste sobre este archivo acústico en el siglo XIX. Desde ese momento, pues, he seguido mucho tu trabajo, me interesa mucho, sobre todo por mi proyecto de doctorado en este momento, que tiene como figura central a Alejo Carpentier. Y a propósito de eso, pues, tenía dos preguntas. Una con respecto a esta idea que diste en la relación entre el niño y el animal, o el otro y, digamos, esta asociación que se hacía con el otro y el animal, y toda esta discusión que se dio en la época colonial sobre el estatuto de humano del otro y de los pueblos colonizados. Me hace pensar en el texto de Los Pasos Perdidos de Alejo Carpentier, justamente donde se plantea este viaje del músico a la selva suramericana para buscar unos instrumentos musicales, para probar una teoría sobre la música en relación con la imitación de los sonidos de los animales, pero que termina descartando este músico porque se da cuenta que realmente lo que él encuentra en estos rituales indígenas es más bien el origen del lenguaje, dice él, ¿no? Él termina haciendo esta transición entre la imitación del sonido de los animales a lo que sería el origen del lenguaje. Y te quería preguntar con respecto a, la primera pregunta sobre Alejo Carpentier, sobre este archivo cultural de la historia material que propone Alejo Carpentier desde la música, pero también desde los diferentes tipos de escritura, porque pues no, digamos el problema al que se enfrenta el músico en la selva es si puede escribir o no su obra, pero no encuentra papel, etcétera. Y se tiene que ir finalmente de la selva para poder escribir su obra, pero allí en la selva también encuentra otras formas de escritura, los petroglifos, también la historia material, etcétera. Eso, digamos, ese por un lado. Y la otra pregunta también en relación con Carpentier y sobre otros autores que has mencionado, con respecto a la historia de la cultura africana en América, porque digamos, Alejo Carpentier para mí es fundamental en esos dos puntos, la historia material, la historia cultural, pero también el reconocimiento de la participación de la cultura africana en la formación cultural de América Latina, sobre todo por sus dos obras que yo escogí para mi tesis, El Reino de este Mundo y El Siglo de las Luces. Pero mi pregunta concreta es, ¿cómo, digamos, en el plano de entender esa dimensión política de estos archivos acústicos o de estos otros archivos en la formación de la nación, cómo, cómo tratar o cómo trabajar, por ejemplo, con estas nociones de folclore, con estas nociones de lo popular, que muchas veces restringen esas participaciones a unas cuestiones muy puntuales y muy específicas, pero que no permiten ver la relación que tiene con lo político, por ejemplo, en términos de la formación histórica y social. ¿Sí? Muchas veces estas categorías sí, del folclore no, me parece que restringen mucho ese problema, digamos, cómo trataste.
Bueno, creo que hay varias preguntas en una. Voy a separar un poco lo de Carpentier, que Carpentier pues es un... ¿Puedes responder en español? Is it okay to answer in Spanish? Yeah.
Does anyone not
Okay.
understand Spanish? Okay, I think you can go ahead.
Okay. Entonces, creo que lo de Carpentier es un mundo en sí. Hay varios libros sobre música de Carpentier que me imagino que conoces. Si no, me mandas un correo después de todas maneras, con gusto. Pero Es un problema muy particular porque él es musicólogo, o sea, no es una persona en donde secundariamente va a trabajar con lo musical. Arguedas va a ser desde la antropología, es como Mario de Andrade, también es musicólogo, o sea, son figuras muy particulares en su intervención, por un lado. Por el otro lado, Carpentier tenía mucho conocimiento de las teorías etnomusicológicas de la época. O sea, yo francamente creo que es muy importante. La etnomusicología en el siglo XIX está obsesionada con los orígenes de la música como problema. La etnomusicología alemana, que es la que va a referenciar él, y lo que tú acabaste de mencionar, va a haber 3 teorías de origen de la música. Yo medio las referencio en el libro, pero las puedes buscar. Una es Darwin, el origen de la música está en el sonido de los animales. Otra es, no me acuerdo quién, pero los balbuceos iniciales tienen que ver con lenguaje y luego se van volviendo. Sí, son balbuceos que se van volviendo lenguaje y después canción. Inclusive Humboldt, esa es la que utiliza cuando oye los bogas, pero una tercera también interviene, que es que el trabajo, la unidad rítmica del trabajo. Todas esas son teorías del siglo XIX sobre orígenes de la música. Entonces, esa es una discusión amplia que se ha dado. Entonces, yo creo que Carpentier interviene en ese marco teórico, con un marco teórico que más bien va a existir y va a jugar con en la novela. Eso por un lado. Una segunda dimensión, yo creo que es muy importante ver el papel que, digamos, la afrodescendencia va a jugar en la formación en particular de Cuba. O sea, porque ahí va a haber personas como Fernando Ortiz, como Lidia Cabrera, como Alejo Carpentier, formando parte de un grupo mucho más grande de pensadores, junto con compositores con los que van a estar trabajando. Una serie de compositores en donde esa red de relaciones va a generar revistas, va a generar modos de pensamiento, etcétera. Yo creo que esa parte entonces tiene que estar muy inscrita dentro de eso. Lo digo porque es que creo que el problema de Carpentier no se puede, o sea, es similar a todas estas formaciones, pero es particular también. O sea, no va a entrar de solo de maneras. Y hay una cosa muy importante que ellos van a realizar, que es cómo van a formular teorías de cómo pensar lo popular o la música afrodescendiente o etcétera en ese momento a partir del modo como escuchan. Entonces, nosotros hoy en día vamos a ver ciertas formas de la folclorología o de pensar la poesía oral como muy restrictivas. Para mí, en este momento, yo no quería entrar a decir, yo utilizo el folclore como parámetro de análisis porque no lo voy a utilizar. Lo que quiero es averiguar de qué manera las modos de escucha de Carpentier determinaron nociones de, no sé si utiliza la palabra folclore, no sé si utiliza la palabra músicas negras, no sé si utiliza la palabra sonidos indígenas, no sé qué palabras va a utilizar, pero es qué tipo de escucha inscribe él en las categorías de interpretación musical que va creando. Yo creo que esa es una pregunta clave. Y así un poco resquebrajar, si yo voy a usar la noción de folclore de Cuba de los años 30, o sea, yo puedo correlacionarla y preguntarme, ¿sí? Pero hoy en día la noción de folclore misma está deconstruida por una serie de digamos, etnopoéticas, que son interesantísimas, que trabajan de manera muy interesante la problemática desde qué perspectiva pensarse. Y eso desde América Latina se ha generado mucha teoría sobre eso, empezando por grupos de trabajo como de Bolivia y en otros países que tienen que ver exactamente con repensar todos esos parámetros de cómo pensar el mundo sonoro ahí. Entonces, esa es parte de la respuesta. Yo no, yo creo que tanto las disciplinas, todas las disciplinas tienen un marco limitado históricamente en el siglo XX, ¿sí? O sea, ¿qué cuenta como música? Para las disciplinas musicales es limitado. Parte del surgimiento de los sonidos, de la noción de sound studies, o sea, de estudios de sonido, surge por una frustración y un cansancio con nociones de música que no permiten, o sea, las músicas no occidentales casi nunca suenan así. Las músicas de vanguardia casi nunca suenan así. ¿Qué pasa en la universidad? Que seguimos insistiendo en que enseñamos música a partir de un parámetro que es absolutamente limitado. Entonces, para empezar, eso afecta a los departamentos de música en sí, pero los compositores, inclusive dentro de Occidente, hacen otras cosas desde hace más de 100 años. O sea, Y ni hablar del efecto desestabilizador sobre esas nociones de música de archivos no occidentales. O sea, entonces hay una problemática que es una problemática de poder y de estructuración de los currículums que es diferente a la problemática de creatividad de la gente. Entonces, por ejemplo, Miguel Antonio Caro puede haber dicho que, el último capítulo, se me olvidan estos personajes, sí, que para poder tener un folclore apropiado, solo el filólogo tenía la capacidad de reconocer cuál era la noción apropiada. Y entonces eso puede ser que entonces no vayan a aparecer en los libros de folclore de los años 40 y de los años 50 y de los años 70. Pero eso no significa que la gente se va a poner a cantar de la manera como aparecen en los libros de folclore. Es decir, yo puedo haber seguido la traza de los bogas. Ese libro casi se convierte en un librito sobre los bogas, que ese sí todavía me da ganas de hacerlo, porque es interesantísimo. Hay muchos más materiales entrado el siglo XX y es interesantísimo cómo entran, ¿sí? Ya pasan, digamos, de un trabajo en el río a un trabajo de la zafra, trabajo agrícola, y yo creo que ahí hay mucho del canto, del canto de vaquería, del canto costeño, que tiene que ver, que no tiene un tono fijo, tiene es increíblemente melismático, no cabe dentro de un tono estable, se mueve entre la palabra y el sonido, o sea, casi que le evoca a uno cierto sonar de los bogas. Entonces uno puede especular que sí, que siguen hasta el siglo XX. Entonces yo creo que metodológicamente con Carpentier, pues hay una serie de trabajos, pero creo que más que yo creo que él mismo crea límites a cómo pensar las músicas afrodescendientes. Entonces, son personajes, es que esta es la problemática que trae el folclore, que para mí es difícil que reconozca de la teoría de hace varios años, que es al mismo tiempo identificar a que hay un en el otro, pero restringirlo de las maneras que otros lo restringen. ¿Me están oyendo? ¿Sí me están escuchando? Sí, ok. Entonces, esa tensión va a aparecer en Carpentier, va a aparecer en Ortiz, va a aparecer en Lidia Cabrera. Y ni hablar con lo que la gente ya hace con los archivos grabados, por ejemplo, lo que pasa con Lidia Cabrera y los archivos que grabó Josefina Tarafa, que los utiliza la gente, los utilizó por muchos años como sí, la Biblia sonora para los santeros. Entonces, ¿qué pasa con estos materiales? Tanto a nivel ya de la academia como más allá de ellos. Es interesante, Leonardo Weissman, el musicólogo argentino, también tiene un trabajo fascinante sobre las misiones jesuíticas, un poco una crítica al tipo de festivales de música barroca que se dan en Bolivia, porque se encuentra, va caminando y se encuentra una gente que lleva unos archivos en una carreta. Son archivos de estos de las misiones jesuíticas con transcripciones musicales. Y el archivo se usaba para generar ceremonias indígenas, pero no para que sonaba con el archivo, pero se necesitaba el papel como objeto, digamos, mágico. O sea, ¿qué pasa con estos materiales una vez se inscriben dentro de distintas formas de uso y de episteme? Es absolutamente fascinante. Yo sí los invito a que lean ese trabajo de Weissman también, W-A-I-S. Bueno, también tiene un libro sobre músicas coloniales, musicólogo argentino. Entonces, creo que lo importante es de pronto este punto de entrada de qué escuchaba Carpentier y cómo lo llevó eso a fijar ciertas nociones de cómo deben sonar ciertas cosas, ¿sí? Porque en Carpentier y en Manuel Zapata y en todos ellos no todo el mundo cabía. O sea, había, por ejemplo, producciones comerciales que ya estaban demasiado comercializadas, que no eran válidas. Poco la discusión del reggaetón y todo eso. O sea, entonces también, ¿quién determina el valor de qué cuenta como lo popular ya dentro de una cultura masiva de circulación sonora? Entonces, ese problemático va a entrar mucho en Carpentier también. No sé
Muchas
si eso te
gracias.
ayuda. Sí, sí.
Sí, muchas gracias. Te escribo en cualquier caso.
Sí, gracias.
yo podía decir algo.
Sí, claro, Marta.
Probablemente voy a hablar parte en inglés y parte en español, pero...
Lo que te sientas cómoda, sí.
Ok, pero primero quería decir que le quería dar las gracias por ser tan cándida en el proceso del libro y todo el tiempo que le tomó y como, especialmente cuando usted dijo que ¿cómo se llama? Que tuvo que aprender tanto para hacer el libro y eso, porque unas veces especialmente cuando uno está empezando a ser académico, it seems like an overwhelming task. Pues entonces para oír que eso ha pasado por una persona que ha escrito un libro como el suyo, es encouraging.
Siempre es así, o sea, si un libro lo apasiona a uno, yo creo que siempre va a ser así.
Gracias.
Sí,
Entonces yo le quería decir que, bueno, yo vengo de Teachers College, entonces era una maestra bilingüe, entonces yo estaba leyendo específicamente una oración que usted escribió en el libro, yo creo que el page 66, entonces dice, strictly speaking, then the bogus practice of taking sounds from multiple sources does not mean they are enacting some form of musical hybridity. Entonces, para mí, nada más un comentario, y no sé si usted tiene algo que decir de eso, pero me recordó en la diferencia entre code switching y translanguaging, en que code switching theoretically se considera que una persona que está haciendo code switching, como yo estoy haciendo ahora, ¿cómo se llama? Está yendo de un lenguaje al otro lenguaje. Entonces, considera los dos lenguajes como entidades distintas. Entonces, translanguaging es viendo que cuando una persona está hablando los dos lenguajes, que así de verdad tiene que ver con que eso es todo parte de su repertoire, entonces lo usa todo y simultáneamente dependiendo de qué le da más como affordances en cierta manera. Entonces, esa oración me recordó de eso, de esa distinción. Eso es todo lo que quería decir.
Sí, no, muy, muy perspicaz. Básicamente lo que, me parece que lo de code switching sería interesante para pensarlo con respecto a ese material. O translanguaging, no sé, tendría que entender más los conceptos, digamos, desde lingüísticamente, pero me parece muy, muy, muy sugerente la comparación. Lo que para mí era evidente es que la idea de que ellos estaban mezclando de aquí y de allí para producir una nueva síntesis no me funcionaba, ¿sí? Porque no era lo que estaban haciendo, era una sonoridad abiertas a, a casi que a unas formas de ensamblaje, ¿sí? En donde más la noción de combinatorial, o sea, una noción casi digital, digámoslo así, que se sale solamente de una cuestión representacional, un elemento que es que, para empezar, mis sonoridades pueden venir de estas distintas partes, y si pueden venir de estas distintas partes, no existe el problema de hibridación. O sea, yo no tengo que pensar, aquí está esta pureza y aquí está esta otra pureza y yo la tengo que combinar. Pero si ya de hecho, por ejemplo, como empieza el libro de Anthony Seeger, Why Suya Sing, ¿por qué cantan los Kiseje? Porque se tradujo hace poquito y los Suya se llaman los Kiseje. Los Suya era el enemigo, el nombre que los enemigos le daban a ellos. Entonces ya se publica en portugués con el nuevo nombre. Pero ellos, por ejemplo, las canciones son de las tribus vecinas, del antropólogo que viene y él cantaba canciones de Pete Seeger, pues aprendieron las canciones de Pete Seeger. O sea, este problema de que hay que mantener una pureza para poder constituir el repertorio propio, eso no, o sea, eso sí existe, alguna gente quiere hacer eso, ¿sí? Por ejemplo, manifestaciones religiosas que quieren mantener una cierta noción de pureza. Entonces, el candomblé, esta es la religión afroamericana más pura que hay. Nuestra tradición viene de esta tradición y nosotros no tenemos mezclas casi y vamos a hacer todo el esfuerzo porque eso no cambie. Pero eso hay que hacer un trabajo tremendo precisamente para mantener eso así, ¿sí? Y esa es la intervención que hacen. Esa es la intervención que hacen. Aquí la intervención es otra porque como punto de partida, el punto de partida, y estos son algunos grupos en particular, no hay problema, ¿sí? De que esto pase. Frente a lo que ha pasado en fines del siglo XX y comienzos del XXI, digamos con la reconstitucionalización con las nuevas constituciones en los países latinoamericanos, con lo que implica, por ejemplo, dar reconocimientos por derechos de tierra en Colombia, por ejemplo, y los tipos de reetnización que eso implica, puede haber unas grandes transformaciones alrededor de cómo pensar esta posibilidad de mezcla y pureza, ¿sí? Y de hecho las hay. Entonces yo quiero estar atento un poco a una dimensión histórica y una dimensión contemporánea de estos materiales y a distintos grupos y cómo las manejan, porque no va a ser lo mismo en cada grupo. Pero obviamente la decisión de proteger las fronteras versus no hay fronteras aquí, me parece que son decisiones, las dos que implican un tipo de trabajo acustemológico, si se quiere. Pero muy aguda tu lectura con esas ideas y te agradezco muchísimo que te sirva, pues que lo utilices creativamente para voltearle para un
Muchas
lado. Un tema.
gracias.
Sí.
Sure. Lynn, do you want to ask a question?
Sure, I can. Yes, thank you so much. I found the book absolutely fascinating from many points of view, which I won't go into now. But I also found its implications for studying indigenous groups extraordinary, because it points to the complete misunderstanding or failure to represent any form of sound or music or language. And I just would love to hear more of your thoughts about that.
Well, I think I'm building on a group of scholars who actually were very fundamental for the group, particularly scholars who have worked with rainforest indigenous cultures, Stephen Feld in Papua New Guinea, Anthony Seeger in the Brazilian Amazon, Menezes Bastos in Brazil, and other people as well. So first of all, let me distinguish that from the way the archive sort of eliminates indigenous sounds from the 19th century archive from having a type of recognition, okay? So part of what happens in this, and this is part of other things that I wrote, and they're not here, but, and it points a little bit to the further work that I want to do, which is that in the 1980s, in ethnomusicology in the Anglophone world, but mostly the United States, these two books were published, Sound and Sentiment by Stephen Feld and Why Suya Sing by Anthony Seeger. 1983 and 1984, I forget which is which. And part of what they proposed in those books was that the word ethnomusicology wouldn't work anymore. This is the 1980s, that we should use a notion of anthropology of sound in the case of Stephen Feld, and anthropology of music in the case of Anthony Seeger. And they were proposing that because indigenous musics were not fitting in the notion of ethnomusicology that was being used. Okay, so I do want to acknowledge a lineage of anthropological thinking with music and sound, with indigenous cultures of particularly rainforest, where listening is such a very important, vital element, in which they try to think this beyond a particular type of parameter. So that's one dimension I think that has been very important. There's other people from Latin America itself and that since then have published a lot about this, Miguel Angel Garcia in Argentina, and other names that escape me right now on the spot, but he edited a volume along with other scholars on indigenous musics in Latin America. Also, that volume is online for free. And people like Julio Mendívil Peruvian ethnomusicologists working with Inca musics, how they were invented in the archive in a way. So there's a lot of work. That book came out after this book came out. There's a lot of work that has been happening around this. I also think from the United States, working with Native North American cultures has been important as well. A book like Putting a Song on Top of It by David Samuels on the Apache music and country music among the Apache. Also the Navajo, where country music is very important. So the performance also of popular musics among indigenous groups, which is also very important, not just traditional musics, and how they, are inflected in very particular ways. So there's a ton of work that I build upon, some of which I cite in the book, and some of which I don't. I think that's a project to be, because it's more contemporary work since the 1980s to today. It's a more contemporary project to work with. And it has emerged at the same time that indigenous peoples are producing a lot of their film ceremonies and on film, filmed by themselves or in aliens with other, anyway, that pertains to the whole rise of an indigenous film collectives and movements in all of Latin America. And that's how music is getting documented today by themselves very strongly. And so that would point to a totally different history or mode of documentation that raises a ton of questions as well. But I just want to make sure that I build on the shoulders of a lot of people. It's just that this 19th century are, characters just wrote them out completely of the archive of a ballad sonority. But so did they write out the bogas, which are at that time half indigenous and half Afro-descendant. Mm-hmm. And the bogas were a fundamental sonority of the 18th and 19th century. They manned every single river. There was no other way of moving around. So they appear in Maria and they appear in La Voragine and of course they do. And yet you look at the history of music and they're nowhere to be found. Nowhere, not even in the folklore texts, where you do find cumbia and bambuca and all those. They don't appear anywhere, so how to transform those situations. But in the case of indigenous musics, I think there's a changing paradigm, and a lot has been worked, that I didn't work on for that book.
I actually lived among the Campa in the Amazonian rainforest of Peru. And the only document at that time was the Summer School of Linguistics copy of the Bible. I mean, I'm not sure that there's too much more, in fact, in terms
there we go.
Transcribed. So, I mean, it's remarkable how little there is, in fact.
Yes.
Have you encountered the novel Risaralda in Colombia?
In my memory, but not right now or recently.
Okay, there are questions of language there, but another time. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, and nice to meet you too.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, that's true. A lot is left to be done. Most of it, but still, I just want to acknowledge that there's people out there working. Yeah.
I have a question about what you said. Hearing is always or very often impure, and transcription as well, that as you can never really reproduce the sound of the language in written language. But I was trying to find out, because language is such a living process and so musical, and every person has a different way of listening, every person has a different way of speaking. It's always alive. Every family has their own way of speaking, pronunciation, intonation, everything. So I was thinking, rather than despectively calling it impure, which is something you also point out in the book, right? How people write about language lacking something, instead of saying they have these and these sounds, they have something that we don't have, So instead of talking about lack, you could talk about the wealth or all the things they have. And in this case, you could, instead of talking about impurity, we could talk about the creativity of language or something. So my question is, not only how do people deal with language and how do they categorize them and how is that a colonial strategy to control someone, but also how is language per se a colonial tool, because this is something I think that becomes now more evident with the worldwide use of English. Y yo lo estoy preguntando en inglés, pero like this whole fear of how English will maybe, or how language will be homogenized all over the world, and then we lose all those different logics that do exist in other languages, like all the different perceptions, all the different ways of how it's possible to describe an eternal movement or a non-eternal movement, or if someone has said something or I witnesses it myself, etc. So yeah, what is the role of language in the process of colonization?
Well, I think the book, that's a huge question. So there's multiple colonial ideologies of language. Again, I think a lot of people have written about this, and not necessarily a specialist in that particular area, but the particular thing that the book does address is how the inscription of a certain form of listening favors certain notions of language over others. So I think each chapter addresses different dimensions of that. So I'm being very, very prescriptive to the book because it's just such a huge question. But one of that fear of what's going to happen to Spanish, that now that Latin American nations are no longer dependent on Spain and are breaking up, was a huge fear in the 19th century. It organized a lot of the discussions of the philologists as they were working the nations together, from Andrés Bello to Miguel Antonio Caro, to all of those discussions that were happening all throughout Latin America. Those discussions had to do with the fear of falling apart, not of unable to keep the homogeneity is a good thing, actually, and then that's also plays a very important role in of course excluding indigenous languages and excluding accents, types of accents, and in Colombia the eternal struggle between Caribbean forms of stating things and non-Caribbean ones, etc. So there's many dimensions to this. I think what is interesting to note is how the process of inscription into a material form, what do they try to do? Do they try to fix something, and then who fixes it? What is the authority for fixing versus who does that, and how is that done? I think it's a fundamental question. It's a question that remains until today. So the other thing is that we have to distinguish between ideological processes and genocide. Those are, I think also who wants to preserve and why is a very important question today. Who determines how to deal with heritages? Because indigenous groups themselves are very interested in modes of preservation, whatever those are. So that's an important question for them too. What are the parameters? How is the counter archive going to be constituted? Who constitutes it? So that's a question that is not only coming. I'm not able to read the chat at the same time, but I'm able to read that that the process of archiving is colonial. Of course, it's colonial, but also indigenous groups want to archive. So how do you develop this counter archive as well? It's especially bureaucratic. I think it's not only colonial. I think there's a history of bureaucracy that intervenes very strongly. That's what the archive has been tied to. But there's also, changing notions of the archive as more histories of the materiality of, we have a long 20th century with certain materials, film, sound, writing. It's not exactly the same type of archive as the 19th century. So, and this is not produced only in the West. There's films and sound being recorded in Brazil and in Indonesia and in India, and from the early 20th century. So how are these archives constituted and co-constituted? And of course, there's a huge colonial power. In ethnomusicology alone, that's enormous, from the Bureau of American Ethnology in the United States to the Berlin and Vienna sound archives. But also there's a lot of other processes going on with archiving that are fundamental. I don't have, Yanis, you might want to ask your questions. I really don't, I'm not able to answer and read at the same time. So I invite you to just formulate your questions maybe.
Yes, and I don't want to interrupt.
No, I'll stop there because I think your question is related.
Right, but I was putting them also in the chat as a form of archiving as well.
Okay, fantastic.
Right. So I have two questions. I mean, I don't know. You touched on many of the points that I was putting in the chat as I was putting them in the chat. So that's an impressive convergence of minds.
Right.
But I was another question I was issuing is, which is very it's in the current zeitgeist, is the issue of reparations. And in terms of cultural appropriation, and especially music, which is, I don't think we would have a music industry if we disallowed cultural appropriation and across influencing. However, in this case, so what do you think of that? Would that be a tractable pathway to try to adjudicate and determine appropriation, and then have the musical industry, the record companies issue, reparations? I mean, and is that would that be a Pandora's box? Because that's not just for the indigenous people. I mean,
yeah, that's a huge discussion. Yes, I understand your question. I mean, part of the discussion has been done by the world music industry literature, the world music. Again, Stephen Feld has participated in that, but a lot more, mostly along Afro-descendant music. So that's been a huge discussion there about those histories of appropriation and how they circulate. There's a lot, you could teach one single course for one semester on that material. Now, the other materials which are different, which are, what do you do with indigenous recordings housed, for example, in the Columbia University Ethnomusicology archives? So in the United States, that is worked, and maybe in the Anglophone world, I don't know, with notions of repatriation. How do you return? Musics, it's the same notion that was used to return, that's being used to return bodies and that type of elements. So I invite you to read, for example, Aaron Fox's work on repatriation with Inupiaq and how that has worked. Sometimes it's possible to return the musics themselves and let them do whatever, but the legal rights to the music, even if that's not industrial, but it's a complex arrangement between archives, is very difficult. Another process online that you can read about repatriation is the one that, very pioneering process in a way in the 1980s is online at the Smithsonian. It has to do with the Omaha archive that her name is Dorothy Sarah Lee, began returning those materials. So there's multiple examples of this going on, and they're documented, and you can find them in literature. The question is, what is the framework for doing so? Who wants their materials back? Because I had a graduate student who went actually and took her, she had recorded things 10 years earlier, came here to Columbia, saw that this repatriation process was going on and wanted to go and do the same thing with the materials she had recorded, and they told her, we don't need those. We have our stuff archived in the stones, So how each community deals with these processes of repatriation is really complex. I think the other issue of industrial production, and the way Shakira and her husband went and recorded or her former husband in the Pacific Coast in Colombia, etc. A lot of that has been written into the literature as a critique. The music industry is extremely difficult to deal with, especially the large companies. you cannot even access their archives, let alone initiate process of repatriation for people that have wanted to do the history of the music industry, for example. Things that were formerly Brazilian owned are now owned by Sony or by whatever the new name of the company is. And if you're a music historian and you want to work on the initial productions of people, even people like Caetano Veloso or something like that, it's almost impossible. They don't let you access the archives. So working with the private industry and how that has happened is tremendously difficult. So it is a huge, complex program. At the same time, you know, appropriations are many. So what is the, you know, what is the, how to think appropriations from different points of view is also an interesting problematic, as you yourself say. Yeah, that's how music works. Yeah, the problem is not only that, but at the same time, the issue of acknowledgement and who needs to be acknowledged and who doesn't get acknowledged, etc. So that's, you know, it is a huge problematic in music. So.
We're almost done. We have 2 more minutes. Gloria, if you would like to, I saw that in the chat, you were making a point about intellectual property. If you want to comment on that, you're welcome to.
Oh, well, I was just, you know, kind of thinking in relationship to the questions that were being asked. And I think some of the questions about repatriating are also directly engaged with intellectual property, and intellectual property has a long history of, you know, being a colonial institution. And part of the way that they are going around the question of individual authorship versus collective knowledge has been, you know, the creation of this regime of different what's called sui generis laws that each nation state can kind of create to deal with the question of collective knowledge and appropriation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So that was just my comment.
Yeah, completely. At the same time, it's very interesting. Once what has happened, for example, there's an Australian archive called, I think it's Mukurultu. I don't remember the name. I would need to regard it, but when you work with indigenous communities, the material has always been open because it's patrimony, it's folklore, and folklore doesn't go through the same property rights as authored works. So that's why they're available for grabs. And what communities want to do is say, no, we control who grabs it. So what type of, it's not only the authorial rights, it's also the patrimonio, los derechos de patrimonio, which are always of the nation, which means that if you wanted to use it for whatever, you could openly, and you still can. So the other question that this brings about is, what about different collectivities determine how they determine their rights? And it's not only related to authorial rights, it's also related to what is an open source, because then the open source communities get upset. Oh, how come you're not, you know, making your stuff available for open source? Well, it's always been open source. That's exactly what we don't want. We want to be able to determine how we share it. And it's not that the other choice is authorial rights, it's that maybe there's other alternatives that they want to look for. So it's like trapped between one model and the other, or what's in a model that has two modes of ascribing. So that's the other dimension to that. But yes, absolutely, those are central to this whole discussion.
Okay, well then, thank you all so much for this lively discussion on both the chat and the Zoom, both scripted and oral. And I really loved reading the book. I totally recommend to everyone also reading all the other chapters that we might have only lightly touched upon today. My favorite part was what you wrote about Obeso's poetry, which reminded me of Nicolas Guillen, with this very creative orthography where you see there's so much happening. But yes, and also all the very interesting people, 19th century scholars and their works and their and their contributions that have not been heard. I think it's very interesting how you pointed out that they're that they're native by birth, but not by language. So that whole dialectic was very, very interesting. There's so many things that you've contributed to this discussion, and I'm so grateful. So thank you so much. And thank you everybody for the discussion. And before we say auf Wiedersehen in German, before we meet again in 2 weeks, I would like to announce our next session, number 16, for June 15th with Professor Richard Leventhal from Penn, who's going to talk about decolonizing museums and archaeology, recent failures and future models as his title. Now, welcome you all to join us for that discussion in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much. This is great.
Bye. Thank you.
Goodbye.